The first thing I ever posted on this channel was an almost 9-hour video about Five Nights at Freddy's, talking about the story, the history, and the lore. I made the video for people who knew nothing about FNAF, or maybe people who'd seen MatPat's videos 10 years ago. So explaining what MatPat said in all those old videos, the things he got right and the things he got wrong, were a very important aspect in discussing the history of the Five Nights at Freddy's community. I did not foresee backlash to discussing what MatPat got wrong. I was incorrect. I honestly think it's a bit sad that you went out of your way to bring MatPat into this. Video was a fun watch till you started laying into MatPat for no reason, unsubbed. Great video, but the constant digs at MatPat is kinda rude. I can understand you disagree with MatPat, but you come off as a bit disrespectful for literally no reason. I love MatPat. I think he's actually the most important voice that has ever been on YouTube. He inspired the creation and the operation of my first 2 YouTube channels before I ever even started talking about Five Nights at Freddy's. But ultimately, it doesn't matter that I thought I was being funny with my over-the-top and clearly ironic reactions that were manifestations of my parasocial relationship with MatPat. What matters is that people didn't know that's what I was doing. My audience doesn't understand what's going on in my head. How are they supposed to know when I'm kidding and when I'm serious? I was blindsided by this negative reaction, and so I made an immediate change to my channel. I came up with the Freddy's acronym. Freddy's stands for Friendly, Respectful Engagement, Discussion, and Discourse Yields Success. I end all of my videos with Freddy's for 3 reasons. 1, it keeps me honest. I hold myself to this standard, so if I ever talk about a topic that I'm particularly passionate about, I never lose sight of the values that I'm trying to instill in my audience. 2, hopefully it instills this value in my audience. And 3, it makes my intentions clear. In some videos, I might say things with some ambiguity. I might not explain them properly. I might say things that have secondary meanings that I don't understand. And if that ever occurs, I want my viewers to know I never have been, and never will be, intentionally disrespectful. Which is why the worst thing I've seen on my channel are people who think I'm being rude to MatPat and are cheering me on. MatPat sucks. This video just goes to show how bad MatPat is in terms of lore explanation. MatPat has become so arrogant and now thinks that he's the end-all be-all of FNAF. He'll never admit he's wrong, and hasn't come out with a decent theory since before FNAF. I don't even watch him anymore. I understand that MatPat can be a divisive figure on the internet, especially on Five Nights at Freddy's related subreddits. I've seen this on Twitter and in my comment section. People really hate MatPat. He doesn't know the facts. He's using his big platform to spread misinformation. He only invites people onto his panels who already agree with him. Many people dislike MatPat's videos and theories, but instead of arguing against his evidence and conclusions, they call him the most vile names you could possibly think of. Instead of making jokes about how Dream Theory is silly and how Phone Guy isn't Purple Guy, they insult him and attack his company and his friends. In one of my videos, I was discussing the way that people have different ways of thinking, which can make communication between them difficult because they'll interpret the same piece of evidence in different ways. I discussed a video in which MatPat broke down his audience in terms of the Myers-Briggs personality assessment, and he was able to correlate people's results in that test with whether or not they believed that the Five Nights at Freddy's books were in canon with the games. I was called a white supremacist for doing this. Myers-Briggs personality test has its roots in a centuries-old eugenics movement. Apparently that trickles down into MatPat using the modern-day assessment quiz, and also to me, quoting MatPat, as a single example of why people are different. This post was not made by somebody who was concerned that MatPat and I might be spreading hate. This post was made by somebody who wanted to discredit MatPat's theories without doing the legwork, wanted to discredit the Five Nights at Freddy's books not being canon argument by calling the most powerful voice on that side a white supremacist. The people who say things like that say them because they're bad at arguing. Their frustration boils over in their desperation to be heard. They just aren't good enough to have their own ideas be heard. So instead they poison their opponents. They poison their ideas instead of discussing them. Finding faults in people is easy. Discussing ideas is hard. And changing people's minds by clawing at their emotions is easier than using reason. This is because there's a human tendency to want to hold on to what you currently believe. Some people have posited that this is because your brain notices that you're still alive, you're doing pretty well, and thus what you currently believe must be working in some capacity, and so you're against changing your mind. You're against changing what's currently working. Changing your mind, especially on some long-held beliefs, especially on things that are deeply integrated into your personality, is painful. And that's why it's difficult to deprogram people from cults. People go from uninformed, neutral, or undecided on certain topics to picking a side with very little convincing required. Think of knowledge like a shield or an armor around you. When you enter into a topic with no armor, it's very easy for you to be taken over into one side. The first thing you hear is likely to persuade you because humans have a tendency to want to join groups. Someone tells you something, you believe it, and now you're on their side. When someone on the other side comes to you and tries to convince you to join their side, before they can even begin, they need to penetrate your armor. They need to convince you not only of their own ideas, but that the ideas you've already learned are wrong. And the problem is that people do not rely on reason. We rely on emotional states. And fitting in with people is one of the major driving forces behind our actions. It's why the first argument you hear is so convincing. You're now part of a group. You've made a connection. You've taken part of those people and brought it into yourself. You've formed a new identity. There's a bond between you and them, and to break that bond to move to a different side is viewed as a lateral move. You have a bond over here, and now you have a bond over here. But the movement between them is painful. So why would anyone ever make the decision to change their mind? You're gaining nothing emotionally, and it's painful. This is the challenge for people who talk about ideas on YouTube. So, let's just say FNAF theorists. How do we change people's minds? Well, as theorists, we have two jobs, right? There's education, which is talking to someone who doesn't have an opinion and giving them information. And then there's theorizing, in which our audience might be neutral people, people who already agree with us, people who vehemently disagree. When you make a theory, you're always going up against different colors of armor with different thicknesses. It's not enough to have solved the lore. You also have to communicate it in such a way that it penetrates people's armor. Let's use an example. The community spent many years believing that the crying child's name was Evan. This name comes from solving a puzzle in the Five Nights at Freddy's security logbook. Many people have Evan armor, but there's a fantastic video by Hyperdroid where he explains that the crying child's name is actually Dave. He does this in an expertly convincing way to his massive audience. This was able to break through many people's armor and move them over to the Dave side. Chiptide also has a great video about why the crying child's name is not Evan. And I think that watching these videos back to back would be a great 1-2 punch of dismantling someone's Evan armor. Someone who believed this deeply for 5 years would probably have that opinion shattered and replaced by the Dave opinion just by watching these two videos. But these are two professional videos expertly crafted by some of the smartest people in the Five Nights at Freddy's community. What do you do if you're not two of the smartest people in the Five Nights at Freddy's community? Well, you see, there's a shortcut to getting people to change sides. You could dismantle their armor, you could show weak points, you could convince them with reason, with well-articulated, convincing arguments. Or you could poison the people whose armor they wear. If you stay over there, you're going to be ostracized by people. All of you Evan people are wrong, and you should feel bad. Tearing down a person instead of an idea unfortunately works. Like I said, it's almost like a cheat code. The person who called MatPat a white supremacist was not doing it because they actually think MatPat's a white supremacist. They're doing it because they think the Five Nights at Freddy's Tales from the Pizzaplex books are canon. But instead of arguing that point coherently, instead of poking holes into MatPat's argument, instead of putting out their own ideas in a convincing way, they poisoned MatPat. On the surface, when you pull back, this argument is clearly nonsense. The Five Nights at Freddy's books are canon because eugenics is bad. This is unreasonable. This makes absolutely no sense, but people don't always use sense. Eugenics is bad. MatPat is supporting eugenics. MatPat believes the books aren't canon. You don't want to be on MatPat's side, do you? So if people don't operate on reason, but our society works best when people use their reason to make decisions, how do we get people to do this? Well, long ago we figured out this problem and we came up with a great solution, and it's to give people an emotional attachment to the concept of truth. The thing that we typically do to aid people in deciding to make the lateral movement from one group to another in which the movement is painful is to instill in them a value for the truth. It's worth it to go through that pain, to lose some social acceptance, if it means you're moving to the side that's factually correct. And we teach this to people when they're young, that truth is a good thing. The scientific method requires acknowledging that truth is a worthy goal to achieve, and many of the most popular philosophies and religions in our culture directly state that there is a truth, and that finding that truth is your purpose. Seeking truth is important, and thankfully in the 21st century, I think if you ask the average person if they value truth or finding truth motivates them, they would say yes, but that has definitely not always been the case. The church back in the day certainly held higher values than the truth that they proclaimed to be fighting for. In fact, they usually put obtaining power over actually spreading the truth. Russian-style communism also required suppressing truth. Truth didn't matter. Power was the only thing that mattered. And this was echoed in the society of George Orwell's 1984, where instead of truth being objective, truth was controlled by an authoritarian government. Seeking truth and valuing truth are not the natural state of humanity, and we could lose that value at any time if we're not careful. Valuing truth helps making the lateral move between two different groups less painful. It counterbalances a human's nature to want to pick a group and stick with it. If we value truth, we can change minds. If we don't value truth, then, well. But the other method, the method of poisoning one side, is unfortunately just as effective. You can make it difficult for someone to stay over in this group. You can eliminate everyone else in that group. You can make it so painful that they beg to leave. And it doesn't matter if the side who's doing this is factually correct. This can never be the way that we convince someone. Not because it doesn't work, it unfortunately does work, but because it ends up destroying both sides and it hurts people. It makes people dumber to give them the choice of picking the side that's poisoned or not poisoned, instead of asking them to use their reason and pick the side that's telling the truth. It takes away people's ability to think for themselves and to learn. It makes people feel hopeless. It unites people under what they hate instead of what they like, and it hurts innocent people along the way. Trying to convince somebody that the Tales from the Pizzaplex books are canon by calling the biggest voice in that community who doesn't think they're canon a white supremacist cannot be how this is allowed to work. It might get results, but it doesn't get success. You might win the numbers game, but you lose yourself along the way. Because I feel bad about the way that my words have come across in the past, I decided to make a very overt pivot on my channel to the things I discuss. I want to instill values into people. I want to instill the value of seeking truth to people in my community. So I started a live stream series called A Brief Calm Discussion, or ABCD, because I believe that this is a topic so simple that a child should understand it. On each of these streams, I find two creators who have different opinions on a topic, and I give each the opportunity to speak. I give them a friendly environment to say their piece. In my series, I've covered two topics so far. The question of if the Tales from the Pizzaplex books are canon or not, and the question of when Charlotte died, in 1983 or 1987. And the goal I have for that series is to open discussion, to talk to people and hear their points, because talking to people and hearing their points is the heart of being Freddy's, of having friendly, respectful engagement, discussion, and discourse yielding success. And what I found so far is truly incredible, because in the episodes where I'm talking to the person whose opinion I disagreed with going in, I found that they made incredible points that moved my needle more in their direction, that found weak points in the armor that I so proudly wore. Even though I'd already watched their videos on these topics, even though I'd already heard these arguments from them, having a one-on-one, sit-down conversation, being able to ask questions in real time and hear their words spoken to me, helped me to understand their points better than a scripted video ever could. And so I will be continuing this series. In fact, it might be the most important thing I ever do with my channel. I only made it because I was upset that people thought I was being to MatPat, because that's never how I want to come off. In conclusion, what I have discovered after my almost 30 years on this planet is that I think that what separates people who make the most crude, crass, mean, or unreasonable comments on the internet from people who are more cool, calm, and collected is just 5 seconds of thinking. Should I post this? Should I say this? What will people think I'm saying if I say these words? If you ask yourself those questions, it's much less likely that you will end up spreading hate. My first response, my first thoughts when something happens are probably just as evil, crude, and selfish as the worst things you've seen online, and yours are too, but that's okay, because what separates calm discussions, what separates friendly and respectful engagement and discourse from the most heinous things you've read on the internet is a couple seconds of thought, of asking yourself if that's actually what you value. So the next time you feel the ill-reasonable, the emotional, tugging at your fingertips to write something on the internet, just wait a few seconds and ask yourself if that's who you really are. Ask yourself if you're being Freddy's. Do you want people to wear your armor so badly that you hurt people in the process, make them dumber, and attack the very idea of truth? Or do you want to change hearts and minds? It has to be the second one, and this applies to absolutely everything, from whether or not the Tales from the Pizzaplex books are canon to Charlie's death.